Good morning, everyone, and I thank the panel for getting here so promptly. We've heard some wonderful speeches from Ban Ki-moon, from the Prime Minister. We've heard a lot of hopes expressed about regional cooperation. And the key to all the success of this is North Korea. I think if regional cooperation does not solve the North Korean nuclear issue, the hopes for significant regional cooperation in Northeast Asia will have a very hard time reaching any kind of maturity. So what are we dealing with in terms of North Korea? What are they after? There is no North Korean representative here. Too bad. I think the objective of the next Jeju Peace Conference should get some North Koreans here. So I will attempt to outline a few of the things that I think the North Koreans have in their mind, which are the major problems that we in the Jeju Peace process are going to need to contend with. I've been to North Korea 5 times. I started in 2002. My major counterpart is Kim Dae-gwan, their chief nuclear negotiator. I was the last American to meet with Kang Seok-ju for almost 9 years until Bill Clinton saw him on his recent trip. During my first visit, Kim Dae-gwan asked me 3 questions, which I've never forgotten. Number 1 was, why is George W. Bush so different from his father? Second is the fundamental question. And he said to me, how do you function as a country when you elect people as president who have nothing in common with their predecessor? He says, where is the continuity? We feel we have to start over with you whenever you have an election. And he was speaking in the wake of the transition from Bill Clinton to George W. Bush, which a number of men and women whom I respect feel was as big a sort of disconnect as we have had in modern times. They had gone from a visit to Washington by Marshal Jo Myung-rok in the fall of 2000, where he'd gone to the White House, invited Bill Clinton to visit Pyongyang, had been given a lunch at the top of the State Department by Vice President Al Gore. Madeleine Albright had gone to the North, had 11 hours of discussion with Kim Jong-il, and Bill Clinton really wanted to go, but the dispute over hanging Chads in Florida caused time to run out, and he wasn't able to go. And so about a year later, suddenly North Korea found itself part of the axis of evil, having done nothing different in the intervening year. The North Koreans, they feel that we move the goalposts frequently. They felt, and I feel, that the first 6 years of the Bush presidency were virtually wasted. In the last couple of years, an attempt was made to start dialogue. Chris Hill, a very able man, did his best, but he was constantly sniped at by ultra-conservatives who disapproved of anything but externally intruded regime change. So there were various agreements produced once we started a bilateral dialogue. 18,000 pages of documents were produced on the history of their nuclear activities, but suddenly that wasn't enough. And so there was a good deal of suspicion on the part of the North Koreans toward the Bush administration. In February 2005, Bill Perry and Spencer Kim and I went to North Korea. We met with Kim Dae-gwan and urged the North Koreans to make their deal with the Bush administration while it was in power. And we said, do not wait for the new administration, whoever it may be. Make your deal now. That did not happen, and I regret that it did not. And I think there has been a colossal misreading of President Obama by the North Koreans. I think their reaction to him has been over the top and totally inappropriate. appropriate, and I regret that. I think that Bill Clinton's visit to the North is perhaps a starting point for some sort of dialogue, but the North Koreans find it very difficult to deal with us because of this continuity problem. A second very difficult problem for them is Japan. I was in Japan talking to some people who were briefing Prime Minister Koizumi before his visit there in 2003. They didn't seem to expect too much, but he went, and lo and behold, Kim Jong-il admitted that they had abducted Japanese citizens. He apologized for it. He said it should not have happened. It will not be repeated. An astonishing criticism of his father. And I thought this had come as a surprise because the reaction of the Japanese was so surprising to me. Instead of taking it and saying that handles that issue, they suddenly became obsessed by the abductees who were not accounted for. But in fact, Tanaka Hitoshi, the vice foreign minister, had met 18 times with the North Koreans before Koizumi went. They knew exactly what Koizumi was going to say. They were unprepared for the media reaction. North Korea was unprepared for the follow-up actions that they were asked to take. What they produced in terms of remains and so forth were totally inadequate. And so the issue just got out of control, a tragedy. Because when I urged the North Koreans in my last meeting with them, saying, you've got to come clean on what you did in Syria, you've got to tell us what you're doing in terms of HEU, their immediate reaction was, if we do that, you're going to do the same thing that Japan did to us when we confessed something. There's no end to it. So there's a very difficult task before the diplomats that are going to be dealing with North Korea in the six-party process. There's a lack of trust. There's been a lack of continuity. I met with the British intelligence officer who had a prolonged dialogue with Gaddafi and got him to give up nuclear weapons. I raised this with Kim Gae-gwan. He said, stop dreaming about Libya. Those are his exact words. He said, that happened at the end of sustained dialogue. And we haven't at that point, he said, I haven't had a single hour of sustained dialogue with anyone in the Bush administration. This was before Chris Hill got started. So there's a lot of work to be done. There's deep suspicion on the part of the North Koreans, and we're not clear in terms of what they want. I was delighted to hear at a very interesting panel yesterday, retired Major General Pan from China saying, I think North Korea wants a deal. And I agree with him. But to get a deal going, there has to be sustained dialogue and higher level dialogue, I think, than we have undertaken in the past. So those are just a few of the issues that I think we need to contend with. I will not spend any time introducing our speakers. Their titles and their capabilities are well known to you. We'll have them speak to us in the address. They're listed with our able U.S. ambassador to act as a cleanup hitter. So thank you, and off we go. Okay. Ambassador Ivanov, please.
So, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues, I am glad to be here with you at the 5th Jeju Peace Forum and to have an opportunity to share with you the Russian vision of promoting multilateral security cooperation in Northeast Asia. Russia has been, it is, and will be an integral part of Northeast Asia. I will add, in no other region are internal and external interests of Russia so interconnected as in Northeast Asia. For the future of Russia as a great power, to much extent depends on the economic, technological, and social uplift of Siberia and the Russian Far East. To achieve that aim, we need the absence of external threats. By Russia's view, such guarantees could be best provided by promoting positive relations with her neighbors. In that we have made headway. Our strategic partnership with China has become today a factor of global significance. Russia's relations with Japan are characterized by an intensive political dialogue at different levels. To the DPRK, Russia is linked with the Treaty of Friendship, Good Neighborliness and Cooperation. The partnership with the Republic of Korea bears an independent value to my country in all aspects, be that political, economic or security consideration. Russia and the Republic of Korea have common interest in eliminating the war threat in Northeast Asia. The main source of that threat is the more than half-century-old military confrontation on the Korean Peninsula, presently aggravated by the nuclear issue. That issue is of a direct concern for Russia, as the DPRK conducted its nuclear tests in an area which is located at a distance of less than 180 kilometers from our border. We do not like such a situation. We need neither nuclear and missile tests nor a saber rattling by anyone at our border. Russia does not recognize the DPRK as a nuclear power and together with partners in the six-party talks tried its best to convince Pyongyang to give up the military nuclear program. The DPRK's recent actions have threatened peace and security in Northeast Asia. Pyongyang should bear accountability for that, and the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1874 sends the North Koreans an appropriate message. However, we think that it would be counterproductive to undertake steps leading to the de facto complete international isolation of the DPRK. The restrictive measures in regard to Pyongyang should not infringe the needs of the civil population in humanitarian aid and the economic assistance. We understand that the DPRK might have certain concerns about its own security when the factor of force was getting increasingly manifested in the international relations. However, we do not view a real alternative to provide her security but along political and diplomatic tracks. With all our condemnation of the recent missile launches and nuclear tests in the DPRK, I would like to note that Pyongyang's actions were not unexpected. The North Koreans had notified about such a possibility a number of times well in advance. Those events were triggered by the disruption of the six-party talks, and it is not only the DPRK which could be blamed for that disruption. Therefore, if we really want to find a way out of the present crisis, it is very important to cut off emotions. We are to thoroughly analyze all new nuances and move forward while combining firmness and determination with restraint and composure. The recent actions of the DPRK should not be used by anyone as a pretext for a forceful enlargement of own military potential, first of all for building nuclear arsenals and strengthening military alliances, creating lines of division and confrontation in Northeast Asia. It is necessary to take all efforts to resume the six-party talks process and to continue the search for an universally acceptable settlement of the nuclear issue of the Korean Peninsula on the basis of the already achieved accords and taking into account justified interests and concerns of all parties. On the other hand, all parties to the talks should fully implement all their obligations in regard to denuclearization as well as in regard to economic compensations. We should also continue our discussions on the draft guiding principles of peace and security in Northeast Asia in the framework of the relevant working group headed by Russia. In our opinion, the solution of the problems lies not in that first to achieve a complete and final nuclear disarmament of North Korea and after that to settle political issues left from the time of the Korean War. There should be a parallel advancing in two directions. First, in the direction of freezing and dismantling of the DPRK's military nuclear program, along with its coming back to the Non-Proliferation Treaty and under the guarantees of International Atomic Energy Agency. And secondly, in the direction of diffusing political tension on the Korean Peninsula and promoting dialogue between the DPRK and the Republic of Korea, as well as with other countries of the region. It is only on such a path that the nuclear issue will be settled strategically and finally. Russia has been constantly standing in favor of the moves by two Korean states aimed at peaceful unification and is prepared to make its contribution to the cause of inter-Korean normalization as well. To facilitate the process, my country has suggested earlier a number of major tripartite partnership projects involving Russia and both Korean states, such as linking the Trans-Korean Railway with the Trans-Siberian Railway, as well as creating a common electric power grid in Northeast Asia and a pipeline system connecting the Korean Peninsula with Eastern Siberia and Russian Far Eastern regions. We are of the firm opinion that the realization of such and similar joint projects on the Korean Peninsula with Russia and other international actors not only would bring considerable economic benefit to the participating countries, but would also promote mutual trust and confidence, which is the most needed for building bridges between Pyongyang and Seoul. Common work on long-term mutually beneficial joint economic projects is the best way to build mutual trust and confidence. We experienced that in the Soviet times in late 1960s and early 1970s, when the first gas pipeline was laid from the Soviet Union to Western Europe, and the West European companies took part in construction of a number of industrial plants in the USSR, like the Volga automobile plant by the Fiat Company of Italy. Those economic projects largely helped to promote detente in Europe, which led to the success of the Helsinki Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe in 1975. To take another example from the European developments, one can also recall that the first step towards the European Union was made almost 60 years back by creation of the European Coal and Steel Community. I think that some experience of Europe could be used in Northeast Asia as well. On February 18th, the first natural gas liquefaction plant was put into operation in the South Sakhalin in the Russian Far East. That plant will deliver to the Republic of Korea 1.5 million ton liquefied natural gas annually for a period of 20 years. The leading gas companies of Russia and the Republic of Korea, namely Gazprom and KOGAS, have also agreed to prepare a feasibility report on laying a gas pipeline from the Russian Far East to the Republic of Korea. Big deliveries of liquefied gas from Sakhalin are to go also to Japan and as far as to the Pacific coast of the United States. The first phase of the oil pipeline from Eastern Siberia to the Pacific coast of Russia is under completion. It will end at the new oil port and refinery in the region of Vladivostok. A gas pipeline will be laid later parallel to the oil pipeline directed to the Russian Pacific coast and to China. But Russia is not just an exporter of gas and oil. More than a third of the Republic of Korea needs in fuel for nuclear powerhouses are covered by Russian sources. The bilateral cooperation in that sphere may be further expanded. At the Moscow summit in September 2008, the presidents of two countries noted that Russia's proposal to establish the International Uranium Enrichment Center is useful for the sake of nuclear non-proliferation and stable supply of nuclear fuel, and agreed to examine the possibility of interaction in that regard. Russia is an important supplier of fuel for Japanese nuclear power plants too. New opportunities in that sphere have opened for my country recently in regard to the United States as well. Russia and China also actively cooperate in peaceful use of nuclear energy. Will you deny the opportunities opening here for enhancing mutual understanding through cooperation in energy? Dear friends, I think the present issues of security are too important and too comprehensive to remain the monopoly of government only. That's why the academic, the business circle, the industrial companies should participate in working out the guidelines for our future cooperation in the matters of security and in Northeast Asia and elsewhere. I think the Jeju Peace Forum is a very important arena for discussing this issue, and I wish that the ideas and suggestions made by you will be used by the governments of the relevant countries and implemented for the sake of security and peace in the area. I wish you all success. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Gregg, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I am very glad to have been invited to join your discussion today. We are acutely aware in our daily work that Asia is a region where enhanced cooperation will be essential if the European Union is to meet its key goals in new and traditional security threats, in addressing climate change, and in facilitating and escaping from the current financial and economic crisis, as well as the more fundamental security issues on the Korean Peninsula. I will try to evaluate how effective our relations with Asia are and to what extent we are able to attain these common goals, whether it's through regional efforts or through multilateral efforts. I would like to speak first about trade, then the economic crisis, climate change, and security on the Korean Peninsula. In the case of trade, for the European Union, the most important boost we could give the world economy at this time would be a quick and ambitious conclusion to the Doha round. For too long, this has been on hold. It is needed more than ever now, as it is the best insurance against protectionism. Estimates show that if tariffs were raised to levels still allowed under WTO rules, in other words, from applied rates up to the bound rates, global income will be reduced by around $350 billion. That's an incentive. And indeed, a successful conclusion, on the other hand, would boost world income by $150 billion. Doha was designed as a development round. It was always more than just pure economics. A successful conclusion this year would show that the WTO is not simply the creation of the big powers that have influenced the system over the last 50 years. Instead, it will mean a new rule book, the joint vision of the 153 members who run the WTO today. But if it fails, the multilateral system could take a strong hit beyond purely trade policy, bringing into question our ability to solve other global problems like climate change. Moreover, the world has gone down the path of bilateral FTAs. These agreements are not ideal, but have the merit at least of moving states towards free trade. Under the best scenario, they are more ambitious than the WTO and have started to tackle regulatory obstacles which so far have been impossible to do in context of the WTO. In a sense, they constitute a dress rehearsal for future WTO negotiations. In 2006, the EU's Global Europe strategy set the stage for the EU to embark on a series of ambitious free trade agreements that will bring immediate economic benefits to our companies and set the scene for the next steps in the multilateral framework. As you are aware, Korea, India, and ASEAN were chosen as the first partners for this new generation of FTAs. South Korea has also followed the pattern of most countries in the region by quickly jumping on the FTA bandwagon, and it now has several FTAs in place, others which are almost in place, and indeed is about to launch further negotiations with Japan and China. This brings us to a key question: to what extent will the proliferation of FTAs in East Asia contribute to expanding trade and investment in the region and with Europe? A recent study by the Asian Development Bank reported that East Asian countries had concluded a total of 37 FTAs, and that a staggering 103 FTA negotiations were underway that involved East Asian countries one way or another. 3/4 of the concluded FTAs were bilateral agreements, and 2/3 were within the East Asian region. These bilateral FTAs carry costs and benefits. If properly designed, they can contribute to dramatic gains by generating trade and investment among members through liberalization of trade in goods and services and the facilitation of investment. They can deepen regional integration through WTO, plus what we call WTO plus agreements, by including areas where for the moment it is difficult to make progress in multilateral negotiations, for example in investment, labor mobility, environment, and regulatory harmonization. And interestingly, the ADB reported that 38% of the FTAs in East Asia could be regarded as WTO plus. They included goods and services, but also the so-called Singapore issues and the enhancement of cooperation. The cost of FTA negotiations can be difficult, however, for poor economies with limited resources, such as Cambodia. Secondly, the proliferation of overlapping FTAs with different rules of origin and standards can create the famous noodle bowl effect that makes it more difficult for business to profit from freer trade. East Asia will need to manage the proliferation of FTAs so that they function as a means of reducing protection and expanding trade and investment. What chances do we see of bringing this swathe of bilateral FTAs together into an East Asian community and as an economic building block for such a community? There are key obstacles to building an East Asian economic community. The existence of sensitive sectors in most countries, for example agriculture in Korea and Japan, and indeed in Southeast Asia, and certain manufacturing and services sectors in developing countries. The sheer disparity in the level of development and size of population amongst different countries in the region also works against an overall agreement. ASEAN has clearly been a hub of the process, with all of the major powers of the region linked to it via bilateral agreements. The current South Korean government has expressed interest in building a China-Korea-Japan FTA, in other words, a regional FTA, which would open the road to an ASEAN +3 economic area, given that ASEAN already has agreements with the three individually. However, the key problem for a more ambitious community, as we all know, is the future trajectory of the China-US and the China-Japan relationships. Regional integration is unlikely to be built from a middle power such as ASEAN, but will need a contribution from China. It is difficult indeed to see how China sees the future of the region. Will it prefer to remain outside a regional system that would limit its freedom of maneuver, or will it in the long term seek to co-opt its neighbours into a regional body? For a moment, this is difficult to answer. When one looks at East Asia today, one sees an increasing number of small houses, but no overall grand design. I think that for the moment, the region is likely to see a continuation of ad hoc arrangements, but with perhaps a coalescing of economic agreements into a regional arrangement in the long run. This points at the moment more towards a structure resembling a free trade community rather than a political one with strong institutional ambitions. Now, as for the financial crisis, the recent crisis has shown us the limits of self-reliance in a globalized economy. Unfortunately, the G20 was able to step into the breach and formulate a strategy for getting beyond this crisis. This shows us, if it needed to be, shown that most or many of the problems we face today cannot be resolved by individual nations or even by regional groupings. The fact that the G20 was able to agree on a common fiscal stimulus, plans for better regulation of financial institutions, including those with a systemic impact, and other structural issues. The most striking element of the crisis from a regional perspective was the question of monetary stability. The Chiang Mai arrangement was not has not proved, I think, to be as effective as it might have been, because some 80% of its resources could not be used without an IMF plan, which many countries, I think, are reluctant to embark on, and certainly which prevent early and rapid action. This was partly remedied in the course of the crisis, but only partly so. The experience of the weakening of the Korean won that occurred despite Korea's large dollar reserves was not one that should be repeated. The importance of more and better arrangements at the regional level in Asia should not be passed over lightly. Another issue, I think, that will determine the success of the long-term health of the global economy is the matter of global imbalances. The G20 has barely touched on this. The question of imbalances has been partly addressed by economic circumstances, such as the drop in consumption and the increased savings rate in the US. But over the longer term, this must be addressed more fundamentally to avoid further financial instability. I heard one economist recently explaining that given the size of these imbalances, no amount of regulation would prevent financial institutions from taking further excessive risks down the road. The other major challenge we are facing is, of course, climate change. The meeting in Copenhagen in December will tell us to what extent we can agree on the steps that need to be taken. Some of the important keys to this process lie in Asia. Will China and India be able to make a sufficient commitment to carbon reduction? At a regional level, South Korea is to be congratulated for its East Asia Climate Change Partnership Initiative. It has also developed a very promising Green New Deal plan, which will put Korean industry in the forefront of global competition for green technology and production. South Korea has also recently announced some target scenarios for a reduction of CO2. We welcome these, which are courageous efforts, but given South Korea's situation as a developed OECD economy, this target could and should be more ambitious. This is very important, as Korea's profile in the negotiations will indirectly determine that of other Asian countries. If it takes the profile of a developing country, this will lower the standard for the real developing countries in the area, who will perceive themselves and present themselves as being in a different situation from Korea. The key point here, I think, is that we have to get out the message that the cost of adjusting to a new climate paradigm will globally cost about $250 billion a year. This is small change when you compare it to the amount of money we have spent on the financial institutions, and constitutes investment in new production and employment. Actual cost in terms of lost production is calculated to be as little as 0.1% of global GDP. But I think at the same time, we have to make commitments at the international level which will reassure the economic operators that there is indeed a level playing field. Finally, here on the Korean Peninsula, the issue of security is the one that stands out. Will the six-party talks be revived, and will they be successful if they are? Will this regional effort be able to arrive at a successful conclusion